This week's parasha from Deuteronomy 32 ends on a deeply tragic note. Moses has, at this point, come to the end of his life after heroically leading the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt and guiding them into a newly constituted covenant relationship with God. He's proven to be a phenomenal statesman leader while at the same time laying down the very moral and spiritual foundations on which Israel would be established as individuals, as a nation, and as a political entity. These were triumphant accomplishments, but Moses would fail to witness the ultimate fruition of these goals, the embodiment of these ideals, and the Israelites finally entering and flourishing in the land God promised them. At the end of the chapter, God leads Moses to the top of Mount Nebo and tells him to view Canaan, the land I'm giving the Israelites as their own possession. There on the mountain that you have climbed, you will die and be gathered to your people, just as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. This is because both of you broke faith with me in the presence of the Israelites at the waters of Merivat Kadesh in the desert of Sin, because you did not uphold my holiness among the Israelites. Therefore, you will see the land only from a distance. You will not enter the land I am giving to the people of Israel. Moses takes these words to the grave with him. You could be forgiven for thinking that with this final judgment from God, knowing that he wouldn't get to see the fulfillment of the promises and dreams he preached about for so long, Moses must have died in a state of deep depression. But if this Song of Moses, as the poem attributed to Moses here in our parasha is known, is any indication, and if the following words of blessing for the 12 tribes are any indication, here in these imparting words before he dies, Moses is the farthest thing from any wallowing, self pitying mood. I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Oh, praise the greatness of our God. He is the rock. His works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong. Upright and just is he. Verses 3 and 4. Not only is Moses not bitter or despondent over his predicament, but he isn't even thinking in terms of what he was able to achieve for himself or what it might mean for his personal legacy. Instead, he beseeches Israel to step back and contemplate this wide, panoramic perspective of history. Remember the days of old. Consider the generations long past. Ask your father, and he will tell you, your elders, and they will explain to you, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up the boundaries for the peoples, according to the numbers of the sons of Israel. Verses 7 and 8. God has clearly chosen you, Moses is saying, and he'll establish you in the land and build you up. But there will be times when, throughout the course of history, when you will be tempted by false hopes and false gods and led into rebellion. This will result in the inevitable and familiar pattern of severe judgment and punishment. But this people must never forget that, verse 36, the Lord will vindicate his people and relent concerning his servants. So, despite calamitous ruin for a time, with truly terror filled scenes of death and devastation, the Lord's ultimate purpose is never complete annihilation and abandonment of the nation he birthed and so scrupulously nurtured. Verse 43, rejoice, you nations, with his people, Moses declares and boldly prophesies in the culmination of his song. He, the Lord, will make atonement for his people, for his land and people. So Moses, rather than dwell on any sense of disappointment, of unfulfilled personal dreams, he's able to rise above his immediate circumstance beyond his own personal tragedy and view his contribution to his people in historic terms on a grand scale. This is humbling on the one hand because Moses realizes he's just a man who makes mistakes and whose influence was limited. On the other hand, this perspective enabled him to see, as one commentator put it, that his life's goal would indeed come to fulfillment. It would just be fulfilled without him. This is a perspective that is so difficult to hold on to, especially when you're in the middle of a lockdown and can't leave your house and you almost can't see beyond your nose, it feels like sometimes. As much as I've tried to pray and psych myself into reasoning that I might just have cabin fever, it's hard not to succumb to bouts of depression and the intense navel gazing that comes with that. A recent major study conducted in the United States found that the percentage of adults who reported depression symptoms had more than tripled the pre-COVID-19 pandemic rates from 8.5% to 27.8% as of mid-April. And these were similar to reports conducted in other parts of the world. But even without COVID, it's just hard to maintain a broader perspective on our lives, to remember God's promises on our lives, to remember God's promises that we've learned in our lifetime. And this is key, promises that may not be fulfilled in our lifetime, but will absolutely, with confident certainty, be fulfilled because they are true. Martin Luther King Jr., who I like to quote, expressed this hope in a sermon he delivered at the Temple of Israel Synagogue in Hollywood. And may I say in conclusion that I believe firmly that we will get to the promised land of collective fulfillment. I still believe that right here in America, we will reach the promised land of brotherhood. Oh, I know there are still dark and difficult days ahead. Before we get there, some more of us will have to get scarred up a bit. Before we reach that majestic land, more will be called bad names. Some will be called Reds and Communists simply because they believe in the brotherhood of man. Before we get there, some will have to be thrown into crowded, frustrating, and depressing jail cells. Before we get there, maybe somebody else like Medgar Evers and the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi this summer will have to face physical death. If physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children and their white brothers from a permanent death of the spirit, then nothing can be more redemptive. Yes, we were singing about it just a few minutes ago. We shall overcome, we shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. And then he makes that famous quote, and I believe it because somehow the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This double vision, this constant bifocal perspective on the immediate present, but never losing sense of the much longer scope of history, must have been how Jesus lived constantly. It must be what kept him from falling into despair so often, because he too would not fulfill every messianic expectation while he was on earth. Jesus would start a movement, a heavenly kingdom movement, but he would leave its further expansion to others who followed after him. His story from our parallel New Testament reading is somewhat similar to Moses. It's in Matthew 16:13 through 20. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." We've referenced this many times, but it bears repeating that the binding and loosing here has nothing to do with binding and casting out spirits. He was likely using a technical term in Hebrew that meant to prohibit and allow, which was a reference to biblical law. Essentially, Jesus was saying, just as he established a school of thought and an approach to interpreting laws, like how to love your neighbor or how to prescribe rulings on adultery and divorce, now he was telling the disciples that they would be the ones to continue the tradition of interpreting biblical law. "When I'm gone from here," I'm paraphrasing Jesus speaking to his disciples, "if you tell the community that an adulteress should be forgiven and given a second chance at life, those words will be binding, as if they came straight out of heaven." What an incredible responsibility Jesus passes on. But also, what an incredible depth of vision. He's just learned from his disciples that virtually no one in the mere region of Caesarea Philippi grasps who he is. They recognize that Jesus is somewhat significant: John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets, they said. But only Peter recognizes Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, at this point. Jesus understands he will not even come close to attaining universal recognition in his lifetime. But he isn't dispirited or demoralized by this. Jesus sees how his seemingly limited immediate impact would have a gradual but global ripple effect. And he was perfectly at peace with the fact that it would be others, hundreds of years after he had left the earth, who would continue to build the kingdom after him. This bifocal vision I mentioned that is baffling to some. On the one hand, he seems to be working with the painstaking and meticulous focus of a genius scholar and nurturing mentor, laying an entire foundation for a model of teaching, discipleship, and community living that literally requires a lifetime of dedication and devotion to discover, to learn, to be transformed by, and eventually hope to pass on to others. This we all do in harmony with cultivating the unique talents and callings God has given us, whether it is as a dancer, a truck driver, a scientist, an activist, a teacher, a student, whatever. On the other hand, Jesus seems to be everywhere warning of impending apocalyptic calamity, always abrupt and often all encompassing. This would seem to be inimical to long term planning. Why invest in an education? For centuries, millions of Christians have read Jesus' apocalyptic teachings and other apocalyptic texts in the Bible in this way. They interpreted the contemporary political and natural events of their day against the backdrop of apocalyptic biblical texts and were convinced in the year 1099 and in 1492 and in every year after that the texts and their events perfectly correlated and that Jesus must be coming back very soon. In the worst cases, it led to abominations like the Crusades. But most often, it meant the simple forsaking of that dual vision of all that was significant and worthy. Jesus' apocalyptic teaching is a bit complicated, but it has a very clear and critical message regarding the prophetic knowledge of the end times, and that is that there is none. There's only one very crucial aspect to the timing of these apocalyptic events that Jesus imparts, and that is that it will be abrupt, that no one will see it coming. In the same way that you don't see a thief in the night coming until it's too late. And that is exactly the point of Jesus' apocalypse. And it is in fitting with his entire life's teaching. He lived and asked us to live with a sense of urgency and purpose to make every day count as if our lives or the world could end at any given moment. And at the same time, he lived and asked us to live as if the world's end was nowhere in sight, to build and invest for the long term, knowing our lives and the lives of our children and our community would have an impact long, long after we're gone. A concentration on the near impending future robs us of both of these focuses. It lulls us into a false security that the end can't be tonight because of some spurious knowledge of all kinds of things that supposedly have to happen first. But mostly it robs us of our long term focus. Moses' speech on Mount Nebo projected countless years into the future. Jesus' commission of Peter to build the church we know now is generational. So, as we head into this most apocalyptic of seasons, when you will undoubtedly hear one ominous prophecy after another, just remind yourself of Jesus' words that he himself did not know the day or the hour of when he would return. He said this, though: who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all of his possessions, giving them their food at the proper time. That was it. When Jesus comes back, he just wants to find you faithfully doing your everyday thing. You can relax about all the rest.